daily average value that I've circled here with the black circle, at that one value, you have to know all the blue data in that gray shaded box. So you have to know what happened in the past and what happened in the future. And this is just an artifact of the filtering method that's used. So it's the natural consequence of this is that I downloaded this, I think, on the 29th. And while there was 15-minute data available for the last 3 days, no daily average values. There's a 3-day lag as to when that daily average is available. So in real time, when you're looking at what's happening in real time, what are these values, there's always going to be a 3-day lag. And that is just an artifact of filtering, and different filters could be chosen, but it is a basic issue that's in part of the play right now. That issue complicates operational decisions. I think you heard from Paul Fujitani yesterday. He talked about the fact that Sacramento or Shasta River water, for instance, takes 5 days to come down the Sac River to the Delta. The operators need to be scheduling their power 3 to 5 days in advance. So the operators, if you think about it, are thinking 5 days out. And there's no official USGS OMR data for 3 days back. So they're having to estimate it for the 3 days and then forecast it out. So you can kind of see how this lag in the availability of the data just kind of complicates the operational decisions. It also has a transparency issue because in real time, you can't determine if they're in compliance. You can't say if OMR was controlling today. You couldn't say whether or not they're complying today. You can't say if they were in compliance yesterday or the day before. 3 days ago, I can tell you whether or not they were in compliance, but there is that lag, and I think it complicates issues a little bit. That's the first issue. The second is that the measurement data from the USGS, there's considerable gaps in the data. It's missing about 30% of the time, and this is not a critique on the USGS. By far, they do some of the best monitoring in the Delta, and they do QA/QC of their data, which I thoroughly appreciate. This is just a fact that you're collecting continuous data in the system, and the sensors have been in there since January of '87. On the x-axis here, this shows the year that the data was collected, and the y-axis shows the day of the year. The colors on the map or on the figure simply illustrate the quality of the data. So in the salmon color, there was good data for both Old and Middle River during that time period. The black, either Old and or Middle River data was missing, so you cannot know what the official USGS OMR was for that particular day. The important thing to say here is just that when these measurements are missing, and we're looking to do analysis in the data set, and we're looking to justify Old and Middle River flows, generally those gaps have to be filled before the analysis is done. So when you see plots that compare OMR to other things, which I'm going to show you in a little bit later, those values are estimated prior to the analysis. So about 30% of the time over this historical data set, those values are based on estimates that are based on other parameters, not based on the measurements of the velocity in the channels themselves. So we're already dealing with something that is already calculated as an index. The third issue I want to just highlight a little bit is that there are other factors that affect Old and Middle River flow. The most obvious is noise in the sensors. If you propagate the air and all the noise in the various sensors and the various calibrations, you can get noise in the 15-minute data plus or minus a couple thousand CFS. Now, over time, that averages out. But if I'm looking to forecast operations over the next couple days, and I'm very happy that's not my job, and I'm very thankful to the operators whose job it is. But if you're looking to do that, that noise of a couple thousand CFS on any given day is going to factor in a little bit. And so again, it averages out over time, but if you're thinking about simply the next few days, it could be a factor in your decision making. The second part of this is that there's a lot of other parameters, weather systems, local in-delta diversions, how the precipitation comes in. These affect the USGS velocity measurements considerably. They're not well known and they're difficult to predict. Even local in-delta diversions, I'm sure you're aware that we don't have a good idea of what those are at any given time. We estimate them after the fact a lot of times, or we base it on land use. But it's a big question a lot of time. And so these are things that are outside of the control of the projects, which they will love to tell you. But there are also things that we don't know. So how do we estimate them in real time to kind of figure out what's going on? So those are the three primary implementation issues, and we're putting forth a solution that rather than using the USGS OMR that has those issues, you look to a flow index. And there are three primary benefits of the flow index. The first is that it's based on readily available information. This will improve both the operational forecasting as well as determination of compliance. The two other benefits are that it needs to remain representative of regional hydrodynamics, and I think we have an index that does that, and it must definitely remain protective of the fish to the same degree that the USGS OMR is. And the remaining part of this presentation covers these three benefits. This is the flow index. Here it is. So it is based on readily available information. It's simply got two cases. So if the head of Old River barrier is installed, the flow index is a fraction of the San Joaquin River inflow minus a coefficient times exports. And in the second case, if the head of Old River barrier is not installed, the flow index is simply a coefficient times exports, and that's total exports at Banks and Jones pumping plants. So this index is based simply on three variables. We can talk about simplicity and transparency, and I think one of the invited panel comments was that as you move forward, you need to be using well-documented, readily available data that is open and transparent, and these things are available in real time and kind of well-used data for other standards as well. So that is indeed the index. Next thing we want to look at is how well does the index represent regional hydrodynamics? And I want to take just a first step back to look at how well USGS OMR represents regional hydrodynamics. It is itself an index, if you think about it. It's a measurement, it's a calculation of flow at two locations in the delta, so it's not the entire delta, obviously. It's a summary variable, as the invited panel was talking about. And summary variables don't show you the path that water is routed through the delta, right? But they do provide valuable information about what's happening in the region. So let's look at that. And the way we do that is, as Diana was mentioning, we look at particle tracking simulations, and this will give us some guidance of a picture of what is really happening with the regional hydrodynamics and compare that to the Old and Middle River flows. So on the next slide, I'm going to start this animation. Right now, I just kind of want to walk you through it a little bit. I have two, here we go, two maps side by side, so I'm going to be running two animations at the same time. In both animations, I'm going to be dropping releasing particles on the San Joaquin River here at the red dot near the mouth of Old River. The locations of the USGS Old and Middle River stations are shown here in purple. And of course, the export pumps are down here in kind of an orange, I suppose. So given the location of the OMR stations between the particle release site and the exports, you would expect that the level of OMR gives us a pretty good indicator of what gets entrained at the exports. Once I start the simulation, we're going to see the particles start moving around. They'll get throughout the region in the delta, and they'll be leaving the delta and bay. One way they can leave is they can exit to the bay past Martinez here, and we'll keep a tally of the amount of particles that go past there as a percentage here. They can also be taken up by ag diversions and the exports in the South Delta as well, and we'll be keeping a running tally of that in these boxes. This is two simulations side by side. Notice that they're very similar USGS OMRs over the period. I'm going to show you a 3-week simulation run, and over that period, the OMR on the right side is just slightly more negative than on the left, really just barely slightly so. That enough of a tease? You guys want to see the simulation? Okay. So here we go. The particles start moving. We're looking at a 2-hour time step, so you do see some of the tidal variability. One thing to notice is as we get about a week in, the particles on the left are still largely in the center of the delta. We're starting to see some entrainment, around 10% total. The particles in the right simulation, they've moved on, and actually now we're at over 70% of them have left the region altogether. Two very similar OMRs, two very different pictures of particle transport, right? At the very end of the simulation, which is 3 weeks, we have 81% have exited to the bay in this right panel, only 2% in the left panel. And then in the left panel, a good portion, about 47% have been entrained, while that leaves about 50% of the particles still hanging out in the delta. This gives you an idea of residence time too, right? This panel on the left, which was March 2007, had much greater residence time than the one on the right. It's just starting again, I'll jump on. So that showed us two distinct periods in time, and I admit that they were pretty radically different for particle transport for a given OMR. It's not always the case, obviously not. So we redid this about 150 times, releasing particles at that same location. And we looked at what was the total entrainment, where is my mouse, over here, on the y-axis of this plot, what was the total entrainment in the South Delta, and plotted that against what the USGS OMR was, and this is over a full 28-day period. And it's clear that when you release particles on the San Joaquin River, near the mouth of Old River, definitely the greater your negative reverse flows, the more particles you entrain. This is intuitive to most people, right? What may not have been intuitive was the amount of scatter that you see between the distribution here. It's not incredibly tight. And think about this. These are neutrally buoyant particles. If anything's going to move with the water, it's neutrally buoyant particles. So we're looking at the a summary variable, USGS OMR, and how well does that represent regional transport. The two time periods I showed you, one was right up here on the plot, so around USGS OMR of minus 5,000 and percent entrainment around 50. And then the other one was down here. So you see the representative, and they're not entire outliers. You know, there were ones above them and ones below them. I didn't pick the furthest out. I just wanted to kind of make a point. But you definitely see a relationship. So the next step to that is, okay, we see that there is a relationship there. How does the flow index do in representing regional hydrodynamics? Do the same plot, do the same analysis. Now we still have percent entrainment on the y-axis, and now we're looking at the flow index on the x-axis. You may see by your eye that there's a little bit less scatter when you're using the flow index than there is when you're using the USGS OMR. That is quantified in the standard error of estimation, which is the SSE on the plot right over here with the statistics. I would not classify this as saying that the flow index is better than USGS OMR, but I would hold forth to say that these are equivalent measures. You can use one or the other. If the flow index has benefits as being easier to implement, then perhaps it would be a solution for you. This is just one location, right? So we released particles and this location up on the San Joaquin River. Released them every month from December through June for the historical record 1990 to 2011. But there's a lot of other places in the delta we might be concerned with. And we showed a few more in our written materials. I'm just going to show one more here. These particles were released on the San Joaquin River at Jersey Point, up here on the map. You get similar type situations where as OMR gets more negative, you get more entrainment. There's definitely more scatter here, and OMR accounts for less variability in entrainment than it did before. That simply indicates that from this location, there's other factors that affect regional transport besides the measured flow in this location, right? But again, when you compare the USGS OMR in the left plot to the flow index in the right plot, you both see similar trends. You see that the flow index does capture regional hydrodynamics similar to how USGS OMR does. So that's particles. Let's move on to fish. Looking at whether or not the flow index would be protective of fish, the approach we took was to recreate analysis that has been done to justify OMR standards. So we're looking at, on the left-hand side of this plot, left-hand side of the slide, a plot, here it is, that was done it was figure 45 in the 2011 Fish and Wildlife BO. For the coordinated operations of CVP and SWP. That's their draft BO that came out last year, I guess, yeah. And in this situation, I think they were actually reproducing some of Dr. Doriso's work. But this is an analysis that looks at not just OMR, but turbidity as well. So now we're looking at multiple variables and their effect on salvage. The way this plot is organized is on the x-axis is the previous 3-day average turbidity at Clifton Court Forebay. The y-axis is USGS OMR. And the color or the size of the dot is the salvage that was taken at CVP and SWP. Same analysis done simply with the flow index on the y-axis on this right side. If you squint really hard, you can see that some of the scatter that is on this plot on the left is perhaps consolidated into clusters on the right. To be honest, this display hurts my eyes, and so I like to look at it this way, and it's the exact same data. Here I'm plotting USGS OMR in this left plot on the x-axis with normalized salvage on the y-axis, and turbidity is the color of the dot. This is easier for me to look at. I'm used to seeing these types of plots. I think Pat Colston showed one yesterday for Delta Smolt that was seasonal summaries, again with OMR on the x and salvage on the y, so it's just a little bit more familiar. Again, we duplicate it with the flow index. Not a quantitative analysis here, but you could see that some of the scatter that is evident over here is definitely clustered more on this one. I think the further take-home message from this analysis is that turbidity is definitely a player, which is something we know and something that is definitely visualized here, in that you don't get high levels, the high levels of entrainment when you have really just barely negative OMRs occur only when there's high turbidity. When there's low turbidity, which is these salmon colors, they don't really start getting entrainment until you get to a stronger, more negative OMR. So the point there being that it's not just OMR, there are other factors when you start looking at fish behavior. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes this, and in the 2011 BIOP, they did a multivariate analysis where they used a generalized additive model. It looked at turbidity, X2, and OMR to predict normalized salvage. We had every intention of doing that. There just wasn't time before the workshop, and so we'll be doing it shortly after. Based on these results, I'm pretty confident that the flow index is going to perform well in a multivariate analysis as well. So there's a lot of plots like this and analyses with fits and seasonal summaries in our written stuff. I'm not going to go through all that now. I do want to show you one more simply because I found it interesting. This is steelhead, and it's hatchery steelhead. So this is based on analysis that Lenny Grimaldo presented to the Steelhead Project work team earlier this year. This is seasonal average, and so he's again plotting, and this is a recreation of Lenny's work, but there's USGS OMR on the x-axis and normalized salvage on the y. The numbers by each of the data point shows the year of that data, so you can kind of see that the highest salvage occurred in 2003 and 2004, with the early 2000s right behind. This is interesting to me because he was able to normalize hatchery steelhead by taking the total hatchery releases. I think that this was quite clever, and I think that the invited panel, or maybe the fishery resources panel yesterday, recommended that all steelhead, or not all steelhead, all salmon, all hatchery salmon be marked. I think all steelhead currently are marked, and marking hatchery salmon would be helpful to do this type of analysis, to be able to separate wild from hatchery when you're looking at salvage. Anyways, once again, same analysis with the flow index, same type of representation of salvage, so we're able to protect the species if we use the flow index versus using the OMR. It's just as predictive. The statistics again bear out that we're certainly going to be protective of the species if we move on with the OMR. Our initial analysis does confirm that. There are next things that we can do to take this even further. I mentioned the multivariate analysis that uses the GAM models. We will be doing that as well. Taking this and looking at other species. Salmon is one that we haven't gotten to yet with the different runs of salmon. It'd be interesting to see how this compares with other species. And we're open to other types of analysis that, as people bring them forward and say, hey, how would the flow index work with this? Is it still going to be protective? We're happy to look at that. We're recommending that the index be used as an experiment for next water year. So as we look at controlling old middle river flows under the RPAs in this next year, we're hoping that the annual review committee will consider using the index. And this will allow us to evaluate how well it addresses the implementation issues and to refine it as necessary. So in conclusion, the index that we developed, we believe, solves the implementation issues while also still protecting the resources that we're looking to protect here. So our recommendation to the state board is, if you choose to implement an old and middle river flow objective, that you do it with a flow index rather than using the USGS OMR. And I hope I didn't go too fast, but I'm happy to take any questions.
No, you're actually right on time.
Thank you.
Now, why do you think? Yeah. Why do you think this hasn't been done before?
It has been done before to some extent. I think we talked about it a little bit in the March hearings. There's been a little bit of resistance to moving to an index. People initially, I think, had the opinion that if you're going to set a standard that affects fish, it should be something the fish feel. But keep in mind that USGS OMR is tidally filtered. While fish and organisms definitely have the capability to feel the local velocity where they are at a given time, they certainly don't sit on the side of the river with a calculator and calculate average flow past a point, and especially one that's miles away from where they are. So I think there's gaining recognition that the USGS values themselves are an index. They're taken at 2 specific locations in the delta, and it's not something that the organisms feel. It's a summary variable that represents hydrodynamics in the system, and there are other summary variables that are capable of doing the same.
Stu.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I was curious if I could ask staff, actually, if you've had a chance to review this, and if you have any comments on this technical approach.
Deanna came in a couple of months ago and presented some of this information to us, and our response was whether the fishery agencies had been consulted, and she said she was in discussions with them regarding this new approach. So I think we'd still be interested in seeing what their impression is of this approach.
Thank you very much.
And we are working with the fish agencies, primarily at a technical level right now. That would ultimately need to go up to a regulatory level to see. There's other political constraints when you get here. But we are definitely working with the technical experts to make sure that the analyses we're doing will satisfy the scientific needs of any decisions they need to make.
Yeah.
And what's your time frame on addressing any issues they might have? I guess on identifying and then addressing.
So identifying is, to be honest, this is the written summary we provided to the board was the first time we had anything in writing to give them. And with the board schedule, we weren't able to set up meetings between when that was due and now. And I think we have a couple of meetings set right now to kind of garner their input. In terms of responding to it, we are fairly quick on that. And I really think that we could get an index in place by the next water year, so starting in December of this year even, for implementation. And I think it'd be a great experiment to see how it addresses the implementation issues as they move forward.
Can you add, I'm pretty sure I know this from history, et cetera, but can you just say for the people who are watching who may not be the experts why this matters to Contra Costa in particular?
I'd be very happy to. Contra Costa is, let's see if I can go back that far. We are an in-delta diverter. We are a CVP contractor, but we also have our own water rights, right? So here we are. We have water intakes that are both west and north of where the Old and Middle River sensors are, as well as two that are south. We have our own biological opinions. We have flow restrictions that have us turn off our pumps for 30 days out of the year, and we have additional curtailments that total our restrictions for 75 to 90 days a year, depending on the year. That's separate from the CVP and SWP requirements that currently have RPAs on them, right? And when those were developed, I think they were originally designed to limit entrainment at the CVP and SWP facilities. How we got drawn into this is based on the location of our intakes. Our diversions can affect the flow in those rivers. Our diversions don't likely affect salvage at the export pumps. There's been no evidence of that, and we've been talking to people, and we feel pretty confident in that determination. Not only that, but if we're asked to turn down our diversions by 100 CFS, that's just so they can export additional 100 CFS. So there's not a net difference there. But so we get drawn into this quite a bit. On the same time, we understand the project operator's concerns, and there are true implementation issues that they can't control. And we're just two of the diverters, or we just have two intakes in that region, and we report our diversions. There's a lot of diversions down there that they just don't know, and they're having to guesstimate what's going on, and they feel like they're being held accountable for other people's diversions. And so I understand their point of view, and this is our attempt to walk the line, if you will, and find something that remains protective of fish, but is something that the contractors and the operators can live with as well. That keeps us out of it.
Very good. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. If the state and Central Valley project contractors would be ready to come up at 10:40, we'll take a short scheduled break and we'll be ready for you then. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can kind of get gathered up, please. My 10 minutes is going to turn into 15 here.
I'm going to be pacing behind you. Only because,
Killing you?
yeah, yesterday, I took drugs at around 2 a.m., so they're, you know, I'm kind of... Yes.
Come on, I can only be polite once. If you'd take your seats and be quiet, please.
Have fun. Break a leg.
You too.
You can't be mean to her.
No, I maybe if this distinguished panel would just start talking, they'd all pay attention to me and sit down and be quiet. Well, let's give it a try. Whoever's going to lead off, lead off.
Okay, Chairman Hoppen and members of the board, my name is David Fullerton, and I'm here with a panel representing the state water contractors and the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. We're happy to be back. We gave a presentation at the last workshop as well. Today's topic that we'll be focusing on is salmon and pelagic species, particularly delta smelt and longfin smelt. We have a lot of stuff to present, so I'm going to kind of go through the preliminaries pretty fast. Just to review what we did last time, we talked about ecological change in the system, and we broke it into these 5 categories. The food web, physical landscape, water temperature, turbidity, and changes in water flows. And we tried to identify the scale of change in all of these, and also the degree to which they can be modified, perhaps in beneficial ways, through management and regulation. And at the first workshop, we identified the food web as perhaps the most promising of those targets, but also physical landscape through habitat restoration. Water temperature can be managed probably on a micro scale, but at the larger scale, probably limited ability to manage that. Not certain to what degree we can deal with turbidity through management. Dr. Glibbert has suggested that maybe we can improve turbidity if we can improve the nutrient ratios in the system. And finally, kind of the irony of our conclusions were that of all of these, water flows have perhaps changed the least, at least delta outflow. Certainly, particular streams have had pretty dramatic changes, but delta outflow is still quite dynamic and probably can't explain the ecological changes we've seen in the system.
Dave, at some point, will you touch on the changes in turbidity, if you will? I can recall a time when we were certainly encouraging everybody to clean up their tailwater to reduce turbidity. As recently as a couple of months ago, one of my colleagues and I watched a regional board bust someone's knuckles for discharging too much turbidity into the delta. Though I don't want it to get lost in the conversation that we kind of flip-flop from trying to improve clarity to trying to increase turbidity.
I'll try to cover that at the end. I do have at least one graph on turbidity, and maybe I can cover it there as well. At the last workshop, we were asked for specific recommendations that we could offer to the board. We're still not ready to give those recommendations, although we hope to do so. We will do so, perhaps in the third workshop, and certainly in written form, basically after we've heard all of the science. We're learning things at these workshops as well. And so we want to basically see what the status of the science is, and then reflect on that, and ultimately try to come up with conclusions and recommendations to the board. However, I would say that we're trying to be as policy relevant as possible in all of our presentations. We're not giving you theoretical science. We're trying to give you scientific information that will help you make decisions. And just schematically, this is kind of how I look at it, that there are 2 dimensions, at least 2 dimensions, but these are 2 key dimensions that we're worrying about. One is confidence, in particular in interventions. This isn't confidence in anything. This is confidence in an action that you might want to take. To what degree do you really believe that there is a causal mechanism linking some management action like flow or nutrient reduction or habitat restoration with some sort of biological benefit, and confidence to be.
Can I just interrupt you just a second? Because something that came up yesterday, and since you all are all here and you know the system better than anybody, you can hopefully address it. So I want to put it in early. And that is, yesterday we basically heard that there was in the summer months, there's a lot of water is held behind the dam, and then it's released in the fall to meet export demands, or late summer, fall to meet export demands. And so there's essentially a dewatering, if you will, of or lower watering of the streams in the summertime. So I want to hear from you because when you say flow's not a big deal, that really sounded to me like it was a big deal. So so I'll be curious.
Okay, let me try to address that. I think, obviously flows are important. What I was addressing with my earlier remarks was basically that flow, it is a big deal, but compared to a number of other factors, it's still quite vibrant in the system. We still see a lot of dynamic, unregulated water moving around. Now, clearly, we've got a lot of big dams too, and they are modifying flow patterns. So, I don't want to minimize that at all, but I'll try to address that as well at the end. But these are kind of the two, and I'll try to refer back to this as we go through. Basically, kind of how confident are we that there is a causal linkage, as opposed to there could be a statistical linkage without an identified cause. That reduces our confidence. Do we like the mathematical methods that were used to identify a linkage? That reduces our confidence. And then there's also the question of effectiveness. Even if we think that something is causally linked to a good outcome, like increased fish populations, do you really get a lot of fish by this intervention? So these are the kinds of things that managers and regulators, I think will want to have information on. And so we're trying to orient our work in these dimensions. Okay. We're going to break our presentations today into two groups. The first will be on salmon, and then following that we'll do pelagic fish. And so we basically have kind of two sub-panels. The first panel has two people, Dr. Chuck Hansen, who will be talking about the relationship between flow and salmon survival, and Steve Kramer, who will be talking about integrating scientific information and decision-making. I already introduced Chuck Hansen last time as an old-timer, if you remember. He is an old-timer, just like me, only he's even older. Chuck's been involved in basically everything for the last 30, 35 years. Has been consulting and been involved in numerous processes, including a lot of the endangered species processes and so on. So he has seen it all and is intimately familiar with the data. He's been out in boats. He's kind of done everything. Steve Kramer is from Washington. He's been working for 35 years. He founded Kramer Fish Sciences 35 years ago and has been working in the area of salmon and steelhead population dynamics basically for that entire period, and has authored many papers and reports. So also a quite distinguished analyst. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck Hansen, and I'll pass the baton over there.
Thanks, Dave. As part of these proceedings, a group of us got together and prepared a technical assessment of the available scientific data regarding salmonids. And the purpose of that assessment was really to provide a scientific basis for identifying potential recommendations for consideration by the board based on opportunities and constraints of various alternative management strategies and actions. And today I'm going to present just a brief overview of the findings that we presented in that report. In terms of the presentation, we're going to touch on natural flow functions and reservoir releases, touch a little bit on some of the stressors, the relationship between river flow and survival as well as transit time, water temperature management, the role of exports in affecting survival, the tidal hydrodynamics versus the net river flows, ocean conditions, and life cycle modeling. In terms of natural flows, this diagram is simplistic, but it shows some of the various functions that natural flows support. And by way of example, if we have a rainstorm in the watershed, stormwater runoff creates turbidity. It increases flows. There are a variety of functions that provides, including providing for migration cues for juvenile salmonids, as well as providing enhanced cover through turbidity to reduce predation. So there are a variety of these flow-related linkages that we've been looking at in terms of these natural conditions. For reservoir releases, and I'm going to touch on your point regarding the stranding issue, releases from the reservoirs are very, very important in terms of providing suitable habitat for spawning and juvenile rearing, as well as temperature management immediately downstream of each of the dams. And we have seen concerns and seen problems associated with variation in those releases that can result in either stranding of juveniles or dewatering of reds. And as we become more refined in operations, ramping rates and operations to avoid those kinds of conditions are important elements of an overall management strategy. But in some cases, other aspects, a downstream water quality requirement or some other element, may result in adverse conditions. And so we need to be sensitive to how those interactions are occurring and how they affect the habitat conditions downstream of the dam as it relates to the ramping and the stranding. In terms of some of the other conditions, we've seen that we have relatively weak but positive relationships between river flows and survival, and I'm going to touch on that. In terms of the changes that have occurred in the system, we have relatively weak relationships between reservoir releases and the inundation of suitable habitats, tidal marshes, floodplain habitat, and we can't really achieve the kind of habitat functions without physical manipulation of the existing system. So it's a flow and a physical habitat manipulation that's required. For some of the other functions, I talked earlier about stormwater runoff creating turbidity. Reservoir releases, on the other hand, are characterized by relatively low turbidity, and hence they don't provide the same environmental cue for, say, juvenile migration or the same type of cover for predation that a naturally occurring storm event would occur. At the last proceeding, we talked about sort of the physical geometry of a natural channel. Well, there was some discussion of this yesterday as well. This is a cross-section of a channel under natural conditions. Habitat diversity is complex. We have emergent vegetation. An increase in flow inundates these shallow floodplain habitats that are adjacent to the channel. Those are areas of low velocity, relatively shallow water, highly productive. And those are the types of suitable habitats that really promote juvenile salmon rearing and growth. In contrast, Ted Summer yesterday talked about how we have changed the physical configuration of many of the channels and created more of a drainage canal type system. And that's exemplified by this trapezoidal channel, riprap levees. A change in flow results in very little change in available or suitable habitat for these juvenile fish. And in fact, an increase in flow can reduce habitat quality by increasing the velocity within the channel. Yesterday, there were discussions about how can we take these kinds of conditions and restore many of these habitat functions. And the approach that's being taken is not to do it through flow, but to do it by identifying areas that have suitable elevations, where breaching of a levee can create inundated areas within the range of flows that naturally occur, and creating these opportunistic areas where we can enhance habitat. Many of those, as was discussed yesterday, occur up in the Cache Slough complex. They occur down in the Suisun Marsh area. There are areas adjacent to existing levees where that kind of land-water interface can be reestablished and start to provide some of these functions. John Kane yesterday talked about the importance of increasing the frequency and the duration of inundation of seasonally inundated floodplains. And we agree with that. That is an important function in terms of providing juvenile salmonid rearing habitat. The approach that's being used, for example, in BDCP, is to notch the Fremont Weir, create a lower elevation so that the YOLO bypass can inundate much more frequently for a longer period of time at lower flows than currently occur. So we're trying to work with physical manipulations, with siting of habitats, with design characteristics in combination with flows to enhance and improve these habitat functions.
Dr. Hansen, before you get off of this picture,
Sure.
fresh on my mind of John Kane's comments yesterday, he also talked about, with this hypothetical diagram, increasing turbidity by increasing the velocity of flow. I had a hard time accepting that, to tell you the truth. Do you see the potential for increased turbidity by jamming more water at a higher velocity through the diagram that's in front of you?
For the most part, no. We've
you.
purposefully gone in and strengthened the levees by armoring them with riprap, and that in part reduces the ability to scour and erode those channel margins that otherwise would have contributed to an increase in turbidity as a function of increased flows. So I think the primary increase in turbidity comes more from runoff from the watershed, as well as from areas that haven't been stabilized quite as severely as much of the Sacramento or San Joaquin Rivers and Delta.
Thank you.
Yesterday there was some discussion about stressors, and I'm not going to go through these, but we are going to touch on predation and ocean conditions as examples of stressors. Some of these stressors are related to flows, others are independent of flows. In this case, these are results of the VAMP coated wire tag survival studies. These are juvenile fall-run Chinook salmon that were tagged and released in the San Joaquin River at Mossdale or Durham Ferry and recaptured at Chips Island in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service surveys. From that data, we can calculate survival rates for each individual group. And what this graph does is it simply plots those survival rates as a function of year. So it shows a significant time trend of decreasing survival for these San Joaquin River fish migrating downstream through the delta. That appears largely to be independent of flows and exports. So there's some other factor that is now affecting the survival of these juvenile fish. One hypothesis is that that factor is an increase in the abundance of predatory fish that are occurring within the delta. And the support for that hypothesis comes from data like this. These are results of fish and game surveys for the most part. 2 predatory fish species, largemouth bass and sunfish. And this shows a substantial increasing trend in the abundance as reflected by the catch per unit of effort in these predatory fish in the delta.
But again, you said at the very beginning of your presentation about predators that there's a flow connection to some and then not a connection at all. So you're saying that there's no flow relationship to predators? I mean, when you have, I would think when you have less water running through a river, you're going to concentrate the predators more than when you have more.
That's true, although keep in mind the diagram that showed the levees and the fact that when you increase flow in much of our system, you don't increase the lateral width of the channel, you increase the depth by some amount. The real flow predator relationship, I think, comes more from the flow turbidity reducing the vulnerability of these fish to predators, as opposed to the flow itself. But that's not to say there isn't some component of flow, and we're going to look at one of the hypotheses. And that hypothesis is that if you increase the flow, these fish will move through the system quicker and therefore be vulnerable to predators for a shorter period of time. So that's another hypothesis that we're going to at least explore this morning a bit. These are results of an acoustic tag study. These were done in 2007, 2008, and 2009 in the Sacramento River. And I present them just to illustrate the fact these are fish that were released upstream of the Red Bluff Diversion Dam And this, on the vertical scale, is the cumulative survival. So they start out at 100, and through mortality, that survival is declining as a function of distance downstream from the system. Much of that mortality occurs in the upper reaches of the Sacramento River. By the time in these studies the fish got down to the Golden Gate, there was about 5% survival for these groups of fish. So very high mortality rates occurring within the system, and we think predation is part of that. In fact, I think predation is a major part of that.
Dr. Hansen, do you have available graphs that would show the mortality on the upper Sacramento prior to the time that all the major diversions were screened, as opposed to today, to see if there was any positive contributions by the many millions of dollars that were spent screening those diversions?
We do have data that spans that period. Many of those diversions, RD-108, Wilkins Slough, and the Poundstone diversion, Sutter Mutual, all occurred during the time period that we were doing coded wire tag studies, or the Fish and Wildlife Service was. So they could certainly be analyzed to look at whether there was a change. But I'm going to show you some of that data to look at flow relationships, and what it's characterized as such high variability that I think it would be very, very difficult to be able to use those data sets to determine whether or not there was a quantifiable benefit associated with the screening of those diversions. I think they're beneficial. I was a part of those, but I don't think these data are likely to show whether or not there's a real change in survival rates as a result of that. But we could look at that. And these are the kind of data that I'm talking about. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion about a positive relationship between flow and survival, and there is. These are data from the Fish and Wildlife Service coded wire tag studies. These are fish that were released upstream of the Red Bluff Diversion Dam and recaptured at Chips Island in the Fish and Wildlife Service sampling. And what we've plotted here is the survival for each of these coded wire tag groups plotted against the average Sacramento River flow for 30 days after the date of release. And in our report, we've done it for 30 days and 60 days and other time periods. What you can see is that there is a positive trend of increasing survival as a function of increasing flow. You can see that the slope of that trend is very, very shallow, and that indicates that it takes a relatively large change in flow to result in a relatively small predicted change in survival. And you can see that the R-square value, 17%, is low. And that's characterized by the high variability in these kinds of data. And that leads to high uncertainty as to the biological response that would occur for juvenile salmonids in response to a change in flow. These are the same VAMP data for the San Joaquin River that we just looked at. The black and white dots are the survival estimates for the various years. The blue line is the average vernalis flow during the spring period when these juvenile salmon are migrating out. And you can see that here's our declining survival trend. But I want to focus on 2005 and 2006 and address your question about flow. In this case, we had flow of 10,000 to 20,000 CFS in the San Joaquin River, substantial flow. And yet we had survival rates that were down around 5%. So flow in this example for this limited data set did not accomplish the objective of returning to that previous flow survival relationship, and in fact didn't address the issue of predation if that is in fact the mechanism causing these low survival rates in recent years. This is another example. In this case, what we did was we looked at the flows in the Sacramento River that occurred during the winter and spring of 2006 and 2009. And it's during that winter-spring period that juvenile salmon were migrating downstream. You can see in 2006, the average flow was over 60,000 CFS. In 2009, it was about 15,500. Chinook salmon typically have a 3-year life cycle. And so we looked 2.5 years later at the number of adults that were estimated to be in the population. And for 2006, it was 53,000, one of the lowest years in the last 50 years of record. when in 2000, the young of the year from 2009 that are adults, the current estimate is over 800,000 fish. So substantial differences in adult abundance that are counterintuitive to the changes in flow that occurred between these 2 years. And I think there's an intervening variable here, and that's ocean conditions that created good or bad rearing that really substantially influenced the abundance and the survival of these cohorts. So flow alone is just part of the package. We've seen through these results that larger fish survive better, and that's the foundation for much of our interest in creating better rearing habitat, better food supplies, and increasing growth rates to try and improve survival. We've also seen that survival rates are higher for those fish that migrate in the main stem rivers and lower for fish that migrate into the interior delta through channels like Georgiana Slough or the head of Old River. That's the basis for the recommendations that Pat Brandis suggested yesterday for a head of Old River barrier, either physical or non-physical. It's also the basis for our investigations with DWR in the application of a non-physical barrier at Georgiana Slough. Yesterday you asked why not put in a screen at Georgiana Slough. And there are really at least two major reasons. One is that Georgiana Slough is a major navigation corridor for recreational boaters to go from the Sacramento River side into the delta. And a physical screen would block that as a pathway for recreational boating. The other is that Georgiana Slough also serves as a migration corridor for upstream migrating salmonids and other fish. And a physical screen would create a block on the downstream side that would have to be addressed. We thought that a non-physical barrier is the most appropriate action for addressing both of those kind of concerns. We talked yesterday also about the significant advancements in the application of acoustic tag technologies.
That fish really going to live through that?
That fish not only lived through that, but then was released and was monitored as part of our program. But this gives you an example. We're getting much better at this. We're learning a lot. The technology is improving. Battery life is extending. We're now able to tag smaller fish than we were earlier. We're able to track fish in 3 dimensions and then correlate that with the actual flows that are occurring at a junction. The National Marine Fisheries Service in 2013 is starting a large-scale acoustic tagging study, and as part of that they're going to be tagging and monitoring survival and migration, not only a fall run or a late fall run, which have been the typical species, but they're going to be doing it for winter run and spring run to compare those species. And to address another of your questions, they're going to be tagging wild and hatchery fish to create a direct comparison of migration, behavior, and survival that we have never been able to do before.
Dr. Hansen, I thought, to my ignorance again, and I don't mind admitting, I thought they just put these little guys through a piece of PVC pipe and they came out with a little tag and a clipped fin, but I mean, this looks like major surgery here.
This is major surgery. In this case, what you're referring to is a coated wire tag.
Right.
And in that case, the coated wire is on a big spool and it comes out through a needle and it just gets poked into their nose. It's a relatively small wire, and then somebody physically clips off the adipose fin or it's automatically clipped. In this case, you have to surgically create an incision in the stomach cavity and physically insert the acoustic tag and then suture it closed. And so this is much more, there's anesthesia involved, this is much more invasive in that regard. And we're trying to get smaller tags, we're trying to get better procedures. We've spent a lot of time coordinating these efforts among the various programs so that we have consistency in how these tags are applied. But it's not as simple as the coated wire tagging.
I appreciate the distinction there.
But we have more coated wire tag data, and that's what we're relying on currently until we actually get these acoustic tags together. One of the questions that came up yesterday, or the hypotheses, is that if we increased flows, we would reduce the transit time for juvenile salmon in the river. And by reducing their transit time, we would improve their survival and reduce their vulnerability to predation. So what I did was I took the Fish and Wildlife Service coded wire tag data, and I simply plotted the duration in days between the date the fish were released and the first date of recapture at Chips Island against average Sacramento River flow for 30 days after release. And what you can see is that there is no clear trend, high variability at all flows. This is for a 30-day average. This is the same data set for a 60-day average flow. And these are data, because I was concerned that those were fish released in upstream of Red Bluff. These are data for fall run Chinook that were tagged and released at Sacramento, coming just through the Delta. Again, no real pattern or relationship between transit time and flow. I'm not going to touch on cold water pool to a large extent, just to make 3 quick points. As we've talked in the past, and the Bureau is going to talk at the next workshop, cold water storage and management is critical to maintenance of suitable habitat for salmonids upstream. That water temperatures in the spring, summer, and fall increase as a function of distance downstream until they reach thermal equilibrium. And as a result, we can't use reservoir releases to manage temperatures in the lower reaches of the river or the delta. In terms of exports, we've seen that survival is largely independent of the export inflow ratio as well as OMR reverse flows and export rates. That's based on the results of these coded wire tag studies that have millions of juvenile fish that have been released and show consistently that between 0 and 0.5% of those fish subsequently show up in the fish salvage operation at the SWP and CVP. And here I've plotted the survival estimates for those releases upstream of Red Bluff against SWP and CVP exports averaged 30 days after the date of release. The expectation was that when exports are low, survival should be higher, and when exports are high, survival should be lower. The results are just a scatter plot that show no real trend. Brad talked yesterday about sub-daily tidal flows, and tidal flows are very, very important in terms of the hydrodynamics in the delta. River flows are much more important upstream of the delta. As we've seen, there is no real strong relationship between flows and the migration rates, so that's not a good way for actually moving juvenile fish through the system quicker. In 2012, in the spring, we were able to be part of a large collaborative program to implement an acoustic tagging network in the delta. This was focused on monitoring yearling steelhead as they migrated downstream as a function not only of the tidal flows at these various junctions, but also as a function of a range of OMRs. And what we were really looking for, and Brad's doing a much more detailed analysis, but I'm going to present some quick results for steelhead that were detected at Site 9, immediately downstream of Stockton, but upstream of Turner Cut, in relationship to those at Site 11 at Prisoner's Point. These are fish that we think have successfully migrated downstream in the system. And so this is the basic setup. We looked at the data for those fish that encountered Site 9 when OMR was less than minus 2,000 CFS, and saw that 34% of the fish that were detected here were detected at Site 11.